we need to pull you back to connect the social and the media. By the way, those who took advantage of, it seemed our coffee house was without a coffee. We could have done with one of those big barrels with the cross on that we could have topped up from. Hopefully you managed to get some drink. And also, those of you, I see there are a few grey-haired people in the audience, but the loos are fascinating because they took me straight back to an edition of Call My Bluff. Anybody who is old enough to remember that? With Robert Robinson. Those words, completely unbelievable, and the explanations even harder to get to. But we're now going to move on to the next concept that we wanted to put on the table for you all to start thinking about. Having got the idea that actually the world is social, always has been, apart from that aberration, and always will be. So, that is the new norm is actually the old norm. But along with that, of course, there's a technology change, and that does mean that there are some serious implications associated with that, because the power of this technology, doing what used to be done with various older forms of it, does bring a lot of issues around management and risk and responsibility. And I'm absolutely delighted that a colleague of mine from UK, Jeremy Swinfen is going to talk now about sort of what does that all mean if we accept that we're all going to be involved in social media. Your artists, your audiences, your collaborators, and everything else are going to be involved in that. What are the things to watch out for, and that concept of cyber security, which I'm sure you will know. Now, Jeremy's been involved in this for a long time, online business strategy development since 1993. I see Jeremy's a very, very, very worked particularly with media companies in a wide variety of spaces. And you're not just an engineer, you're a scientist, Jeremy. So science and arts getting together, not for the first time. I'm just going to hand over now and let Jeremy sort of start the idea of what's involved with this stuff and what risks have we got to look at.
Thank you. Well, I didn't go back quite as far as Tom, but when I talk about social media, I do point out to people that back in 1993, 1992, 1991, and indeed in the 80s, when the internet was still very much there, and there were still plenty of consumers using the internet, perhaps not quite as many as there are today, all you could actually do on the internet was use, in effect, social media. And so it's been around for a long time. I had a GeoCities page, which was an early form of social media platform, I suppose, back in about 1995, for instance. And so these things aren't particularly new. The first social media campaign I ran was for Philips, who was sponsoring Euro. A social media campaign in 1999. So these things aren't new, they have been around for a long time. We're still getting them wrong all the time. I'm going to talk about risk. I could talk about the wider area of cyber risk, but I'm going to focus in on social media risk. Please don't think that what I'm trying to say is that you shouldn't be using social media. All I'm saying is that you should think about how you use it and use it in a structured way, recognising that there are some downsides as well as lots of big upsides. So any organisation, big or small, is going to be at risk from all sorts of different cyber security threats. There are going to be threats to your audiences when they're coming to venues. For instance, if you're running Wi-Fi, people might be pretending to be your Wi-Fi and suckering them in that sort of way. There might be threats to your operational integrity if you're getting hacked or something like that. There might be threats to your sponsors. If we don't see Brexit happening, then certainly most of you probably have got email lists of more than 5,000 people, and therefore you're going to be subject to the new data protection rules with the rather fearsome potential fines of 4% of global turnover, or I think 100 million euros, whichever be the larger, which probably would be fairly frightening So there are some things out there with cyber that one needs to be aware of. Today we're going to look at social media risk, one particular type of cyber risk. But because social media is so prevalent, I think it is an important one. It's not the same risk as hackers, it's not the same risk as hacktivists coming in and trying to destroy your organisation, or people trying to steal your data and sell it on to other people. But it is nonetheless an important risk to understand and manage. Why should you care? I imagine that most arts organisations use social media fairly actively. Perhaps not all, but most will. Even if you're not, your employers will be using it and your customers will be using it. So however you use social media, it's still going to be a risk for you because the people who are connected with your organisation will be using social media. And the difficulty is that it can be very influential, obviously, and it can be very easy to get wrong. So what I'm going to try and do over the next half an hour or so is try and unpick some of these issues and identify where they lie and something about what you can do with them. The problem with social media, I think, is that it is still relatively a new concept. Even though it's been around for 20 years, that's quite new in terms of getting your head around a new business concept, getting your head around a new marketing concept. So it's relatively new, and unfortunately, it's turned into a rather fashionable idea. And that is a problem, because when people look at fashion, they're not always using their rational faculties particularly well. So the sorts of things that you get are, we must have a Facebook page, or we must have a Twitter account, or something like that, without thinking why. I remember this back in the early 1990s when people were saying to us, we must have a web page. And the question I would always ask was, why? What do you want to achieve with that? Not a bad thing, but let's think about why you want to do it before we actually decide to do it. So we've got a plan in place and some objectives that we can start measuring. So we need to know why we're doing things, and we also need to unpick some of the nonsense that's talked about social media. Again, for the last 10 years, I've heard people say, oh, it's the end of advertising, advertising is dead, it's all about dialogue now. It's all about having a conversation with our consumers. Well, the reality is that most businesses, unless they're selling Rolls Royces, can't afford to have a dialogue with consumers. If you're selling £10 tickets to an arts festival or something like that, you cannot afford to have a dialogue with individual people. So it's perfectly reasonable to use social media, but don't think that this is going to be a load of one-to-one conversations, because it's not, unless you want to go past very quickly. So think about the realities of what's going on. Now, social media is potentially a very big risk. You can't see this very well. Perhaps you can see this little thing here coming down. This is a picture of the value of the New York stock market on one day in April 2013, when an organisation called Syrian Electronic Army hacked into one of the Press Association's Twitter accounts, and they tweeted that the White House had been bombed. Totally without foundation, totally without any supporting evidence. One tweet knocked 143 points, that's 136 billion with a B, dollars of the value of the New York Stock Exchange for a short period of time. So these things can have an effect. Now, that's a sort of fairly unusually large effect, but I just want to put it out there because these things are potentially quite dangerous. And the thing is, we tend to think of social media as being a sort of marketing activity, as
being something which the marketing people look after, and if it all goes wrong, well, it's just perhaps going to be a problem with marketing. It might be a bit of a waste of money or something like that. We might look a bit stupid, but it's actually not going to damage our organisation too much. Well, the reality is that there are all sorts of different risks out there associated with social media. There are reputational risks, there are regulatory compliance risks, there are risks of asset loss, there are risks to operational efficiency, and they exist right around the organisation, not just within the marketing department. So it's not something that one or two people in the marketing department need to be looking out for. It's something that the whole organisation needs to have a plan in place for managing. And what are these sort of risks? Well, there are a number of different things, the sorts of things you can probably expect, things like wasted investments, things like reputational damage, legal actions, vicarious liability as an organisation. If one of your employees has said something, then you may well find that the organisation as a whole is vicariously liable. You might find that there are issues around bullying, for instance. If you've got an employee who's bullying another employee, if employee 1 is on Facebook, on their personal account, at home, and is being nasty to another employee who's not at the office, the organisation can still be vicariously liable for that. So these things don't just live in the office. Because of the fact we don't just live in the office, we live out in the open world as well. The risks out there that are associated with employees still exist inside the office and outside the office, which is why we need to understand what's going on. We can damage things like IT systems through, that might sound a bit odd, but I'm sure all come across the concept of phishing. And the biggest way that IT systems get hacked into is through phishing attacks, through people picking up information which allows them to find information that will enable them to get into systems. And the biggest place they get this information from is social media. Social media is probably the biggest cyber risk out there. So it's a risk in two ways. One, because we have this trail of digital information that we leave, which we can use. So I can find out that somebody's going on holiday, and I can then find out perhaps from social media also the people that they're working with. I can ring up, I can say, I want to speak to so-and-so's secretary. I know that they're on holiday, but I've got some information that I'm sure they'd like to have. Perhaps it's some pictures of the children at a party we went to together or something like that. And they're away at the moment. I'm just going to bring around this USB stick with the pictures on. Perhaps you can give it to them when they come back from holiday. Well, that sounds genuine, doesn't it? They obviously know each other. They know he's on holiday, they know the names of his kids. That's great. Let's have a look at these pictures. I've been suckered in to taking a USB stick with some malware on it because I think it's genuine, because I know enough about a particular person I picked up on social media to create a credible story about why you should do something for me. This is really, really common. And it's very dangerous. It happens because we leave all of this information on social media. The fact that social media is also riddled with malware itself, that a lot of the adverts that you see on social media, a lot of the polls that you see on social media, a lot of the links that you see on social media are malicious, is another problem. But the real problem with social media is that we're leaving all this information around about. So, you can damage our IT system, and of course, there's this whole area of customer management and failures to manage customer expectations on social media, which can sometimes lead to a social media crisis, which we'll talk about a bit more. So why does all this go wrong? Why is all this such a problem? Well, partly it's because of social media culture, if you like. People think of social media as not really counting. It's sort of, it's unofficial, it's private, it hasn't got any legal status. Well, we told that to somebody like Sally Burko, who you may remember got into a certain amount of hot water when she started tweeting about Lord McAlpine a couple of years ago. There are innumerable people who have been sued for libel because of things that they've said on social media, or who have lost their jobs because of things they've said on social media. It counts legally. Just as an email can be used to vary a contract, something that you say on social media can be used to vary a contract. It doesn't matter that it's ephemeral because it's not ephemeral. There's a lovely story about a director, I can't remember, one of the big banks it was, and he was using Snapchat to send messages to his daughter from board meetings saying, God, I'm bored. Anyway, Snapchat, of course, it's ephemeral, isn't it? It's built up to 10 seconds. Well, lovely daughter took the screenshots from the Snapchat messages and posted them on Facebook, so they lived forever. And this tends to happen with social media, that things don't disappear, they live forever. So things that you think are informal, things that you think are ephemeral, things that you think are private, aren't. And the web, of course, it's permanent, it's there forever. It communicates around the world at the speed of lightning. There's a story about an earthquake in the east coast of the States, and I think it hit, it started off near Washington and travelled up to New York. And the news of the earthquake got to New York before the trends did. It's very quick. And there's also a lack of control. So, what this means is that we obviously, we have work lives and we have home lives. We have a work personality, we have a home personality. We have perhaps a work social media profile and a home social media profile. But the trouble is with social media is that these two things collide. And this is where one of the big dangers for organisations happens. Now, on somewhere like LinkedIn, somewhere that's fairly formal, it's probably not too much of a problem. But on things like Twitter and on things like Facebook, where people very often use them for both personal and professional purposes, there can be all sorts of confusions that happen. I was talking to the marketing head of a big insurance company a few months ago, and she said to me that she wanted all of her staff to use social media to promote the organisation and all that it did. And I said, well, is that a good idea? Because, you've got certain people who are authorised to market your organisation, in your marketing department. Why do you want everybody else to take these messages in an uncontrolled way and put them out there? She was very insistent about this. Really what she was saying is, social media is out there, it's an opportunity for me to promote my brand, and therefore what I'm going to do is I'm going to let everybody in my organisation, without any control, do the equivalent of talking to the newspapers about my organisation. That's what she was that's what she wanted to happen. And whether she did that or not, I don't know. All I can say is, I think you need to try and control that message a little bit and make sure the sorts of people who are talking about your organisation in public know what to say. And this is very, very important. One of the temptations is to say, we've got this wonderful free platform that we can use to promote our organisation, to promote the latest artists we've got coming in, or whatever it might be. So let's do that without actually putting some processes in place to make sure that the messages that go out are appropriate and the messages that we want to happen. And I think that's very important. There's also this lack of knowledge, to be honest. And you get, people of my age, and actually people quite a lot younger than me, who are frightened of technology, who perhaps don't want to show it. It goes back to being fashionable. I want to be seen as being cool and down with the kids, and therefore, yes, of course, I've got to be really active on social media. I don't know anything about it. But George over there, he's just left university, I'm sure he's got a Facebook account. Let's put him in charge of the social media stuff. And George, bless him, he doesn't use Facebook. We do, by the way, have a big issue with the digitally dispossessed in this country. It's not old people, it's young people. But that's another thing altogether. George uses social media, doesn't do much else with technology, but he uses social media. He knows nothing about business. He knows nothing about communications. He knows nothing about brand. He knows nothing about what we're trying to achieve, and he can do a lot of damage in a very short period of time. So knowledge at the senior level is, I think, very important. So the sorts of things can go wrong. We'll have a look at some of the things that can go wrong. But on the plus side, let's think about some things that can go right. And the internal benefits that we get from social media, all sorts of things. Obviously, increased workplace engagement. I think it'd be pretty difficult for an organisation these days, unless you're working in an extremely security conscious environment, to say, okay, when you come to work, you can't use social media, because you just won't get the sort of people you want to join your organisation. So you need to allow them to do it, but you just need to control them. If you allow them to do it, you will get increased job satisfaction. So no doubt there's quite a lot of research underpinning this. I don't know if these charts are going to get circulated, but there are a couple of references, I think, in the notes of these charts. You get increased productivity when you allow people to have a little bit of fun as well as do. This is all common sense management. If you don't bear down on people, they'll work harder. So, social media is just part of that. There are all sorts of external benefits. It's a way of understanding audiences and getting feedback from audiences. Now, I just want to point out that the feedback that you're getting may not be representative of the total audience, because you do get a limited number of people who use social media actively. A lot of people use it passively, lurkers we used to call them, who don't actually contribute very much. The sort of people who use it actively often have an axe to grind. And so if you're listening out to social media and saying that's what people are thinking, you may not be getting the whole picture. So again, it's very important to make sure you understand that you've got an accurate picture of audiences. You're not just relying on social media. It's a great way, of course, of informing audiences. It's a great way of doing that because, of course, you've got this, Tom's talking about, sort of viral effect where people take things and push it on to other people. Now that's less and less of an advantage these days because, of course, social media platforms are stupid, and so they don't want you to go and place your stuff and let it circulate to other people without you paying for that. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to run social media campaigns without at least some form of payment. But nonetheless, you do perhaps have less investment that you need to pay than you might with other forms of media. It's a great way of engaging the audience, of course, because you can, if you want to have a dialogue, you can at least pose questions and ask people to answer them. And people, of course, love answering, they love seeing themselves in print, so it's a great way of engaging with people. And it's a great way of finding new audiences as well, because you can find people on a fairly micro level who have particular interests, and so you can communicate with them too. So there are a lot of benefits. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that social media is a bad thing. I am just saying there's a big but. And here are a few buts. This is from the Department of Culture a few years ago. I don't remember this. These are tweets coming out from the department's Twitter account criticising a minister. Now, how does that happen? Well, it happens in one of two ways. Either somebody's having a seriously good lunch, and there is no way of tracking who is sending this stuff out, or their Twitter account is because perhaps it's got very poor password controls or something like that. So this sort of thing is a problem, and you need to understand why it's a problem. you need to make sure that you've got good passwords in place to keep people out. And if you do have more than one person with access to that password, you need to have a system in place, and it's perfectly possible to put systems in place. They're not particularly expensive, they're called single sign-on systems, but you can track all the different people who are interfacing with this Twitter account because they're having to sign in to a sort of, if you like, a meta system which will track who is putting what into this particular Twitter account. If you don't do that, you don't know what's happened, you can't manage this particular activity. This is another picture which I can't show you. Apologies, I'm not quite sure why it fell off the presentation, but it did, that's technology for you. This was a picture of Burger King's Twitter account with superimposed various McDonald's logos and various messages about the fact that Burger King was horrible and flopped and McDonald's had bought it and things like that. And again, this is another hijacking. Somebody's broken into the Burger King Twitter account and they've hijacked it and they've put up some stuff which is damaging to their brand. Another picture's fallen off, I'm afraid. This is the New York Police, or it was the New York Police. Now, the New York Police, not a brand that you'd expect to call it a brand, but they would expect to do a lot of marketing. But they thought, they were little dears, they thought it'd be jolly good idea to promote themselves on Twitter. So they created a hashtag, which was my NYPD. And they posted some pictures on Twitter of, citizens surrounded by happy, smiling, burning policemen, aren't we all lovely, having a beautiful time with our local New York police. And please post more pictures of your experiences with the New York police. There are pictures of the police arresting dogs, there are pictures of police keeping people where they shouldn't be. Actually, such a successful, unsuccessful campaign, but there was a similar hashtag launched, which is my LAPD, which had similar pictures. So anyway, you need to think what you're getting into when you start doing this. It's probably okay to ask organisations to like the hand, but controversial organisations like police need to think about it carefully. This is quite a famous story about the American Red Cross. This is what I was saying about people getting muddled up. Here's poor old Gloria Brown, I think she's called, and she's forgotten that she's actually on the Red Cross, not her own Twitter account, which is a little bit embarrassing for everybody, I suppose. This is the Nottinghamshire Health Care Trust, and what they were doing is they were posting endorsements on various social media profiles that they owned that were written by employees. Now, for a commercial organisation, that would have been illegal, it would have been unfair trading, and somebody could have been arrested and fined quite heavily for that. Because it's a public sector organisation, it wasn't a particularly moral thing to do, just as it's not a particularly moral thing to do to write, positive reviews of your book on Amazon or in a hotel, on TripAdvisor or whatever, and it is illegal in the commercial environment. Another thing that's illegal in the commercial environment is getting the rules wrong, the advertising rules wrong. This again is just poor George, you see, because he's been given the task of looking after social media, and so he's doing advertising on social media. He's not been trained properly on the rules of advertising, legal, decent, and all that sort of stuff. And so here he is, he's actually implying that alcohol is a sort of training, it gives you confidence and things like this. This advertising campaign had to be taken down after the ASA said, no, this is illegal advertising. It's quite inappropriate for alcohol advertising. Because it was on social media, they would be right, because it sort of doesn't count. It's only social media. It doesn't matter. It does matter, unfortunately. And we can't get into quite a bit of hot water if you don't understand what the rules are. Now, this is perhaps a little bit controversial. staff. Now, this chap here, Rakesh, he's in the pub. He's in Europe at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he's sounding off about some of his colleagues. This is one of the more decent. You can see how drunk he is because he can't type properly. Anyway, he's suffice to say, he is no longer with PayPal the next day. It didn't count, does it? Social media, it's not important. This lady, I want to feel for her. She was making a joke. It's not a very good joke, but you know, it was a joke, she thought. She got on a plane, she was fired by the time she landed. This is not good for organisations to lose senior staff because they don't know what they're doing on social media. This is another little interesting story. This is Noah Kravitz, and Noah Kravitz is employed by this absurdly named telephone company called Phone. I think they deserve this to happen. And he's told go and build up some social media profiles. So he doesn't. He gets something like, I can't remember how many it is, 5,000 Twitter followers or something like that. And then he decides to leave. So he takes the Twitter followers with him. He just changes the name and takes the Twitter followers with him. Well, actually, we paid you to do that. Come back. You know, we want them. And they went to court about this. Now, that needn't have happened because, of course, if it had been explained to him that he was doing this and the phone dog owned that data and the phone dog owned that account, and if that had been written down and explained to him, that wouldn't have happened. But it wasn't. And so all went a bit muddy. If you look at the Twitter accounts now of, you know, any journalist on ITV or something like that, you know, it will say so ITV. And what's happening there is that they know what they're doing is building up ITV's social media profile. This is something they're doing as part of their job, and that data and that brand value belongs to ITV, not to them as individual journalists. Here's a bit of the IT techie stuff. What we get here well, you get a lot of 50 Cent. Booty, I have no idea, he's some caffeine. There are lots and lots of fake profiles about 50 Cent. So what happens, of course, is that you can use these to persuade people to click through to fake sites and things like that and start spoofing them with all sorts of malicious software. So taking people to dangerous sites is very common on social media, and you don't know that that is a fake site. You've got very little way of knowing that. There are something like 450 Twitter accounts for President Putin, apparently. So I don't know what that says. Probably not a lot. Anyway, so yeah. These sort of things can open you to a lot of problems, I think. And then, of course, we get damage to customer confidence. The sort of things that happen with customer confidence can be dangerous because stories get shared. There's a story, for instance, about a musician called Dave Carroll who was flying with United, and they, for whatever reason, they broke his guitar. In the same way British Airways broke my skis once, but the internet wasn't really around at the time, so I couldn't do much about it. But anyway, they broke his guitar, and I told you so, don't find it. They broke his guitar, and he said, "Look, you've broken my guitar," and they said, "Tough." And so he wrote a song about it. And it went viral, as they say. Millions of people, literally millions of people, listened to the song. In the days after that particular incident, the United share price went down by 10%. That was just impossible to connect to. You can't do that. But it certainly didn't do any good. What we can get when we get these social media crises is, a lot of the time, it's just bumping on the bottom and nobody's taking much notice of it. once the major platforms get hold of it, you've obviously got much wider potential. I mean, you know, how many people are on Facebook? You know, 1.5 billion people on Facebook, so it's quite a lot of people. And the danger is then that it gets taken up by mainstream online media, and then later by mainstream offline media like newspapers and the broadcasters. And this is where it becomes a problem. And it doesn't happen all the time. But what you want to do is really sort of stop it going from there to there, because once it goes to there, you've got the possibility that it's going to go up there. And that's when the that's when you suddenly find that your shareholder value is getting eroded, or you're going to find that your customers are moving away from it, or something like that. So how can you protect your organisation from all of these things? Well, as I said, the first thing is banning social media at work. It's not going to be a solution, because people will use it anyway. If you stop using it on some sort of network device in the office, they'll just use their smartphone. So that's not going to do any good, and they'll be irritated with you. So I think there's a process you can do. It sounds frightfully boring, but there's a process that you can do, and it's quite important to go through these processes, I think. You can start by identifying what the risks are to your organisations. And yeah, as I said, there will be reputation risks, but there will also be risks to your IT systems and to your organisational efficiency and things like that. And you can start understanding what you're doing about them at the moment, whether you're doing anything about these things at the moment. Well, big companies don't really do very much. You can then say, okay, you know, one of the things we should be doing is having some sort of policy, having some sort of document that explains to people what they can do and what they can't do, how they can associate themselves with our organisation on social media. I often say to people, it's all very well on something like LinkedIn to say that you work for the Arts Council or whatever it might be. But anywhere else on social media, unless you've got somebody who is allowed to speak for the organisation, they shouldn't be saying that they work for you. Because if you stop this confusion between professional profiles and personal profiles, you will take some of the heat out of it. So, for instance, if somebody's I don't know, libels somebody on a social media account which says they work for the Arts Council, then the Arts Council might just find themselves vicariously liable for that person's libel. Whereas if you say you can't say that you work for the Arts Council anywhere other than LinkedIn, you've got much less chance of that. Now, the difficulty, I think, is that, you know, we're all people, we all get what we don't all go to the pub, some of us do. Sometimes, you know, we get angry and things like that, and so the more opportunities we've got to associate ourselves in informal environments like this with our employers, the greater the danger that is for the employer. So, you know, Rakesh Arbar isn't going to go onto LinkedIn at 2 o'clock in the morning and start posting up about his colleagues, but he did it on Twitter. That's where the danger is, I think. So, you know, making sure that you've got an understanding, people have an understanding of what they can do and what they can't do, and importantly, why they can do it, why it's important, because the why is just as important as the what. A usable policy. Now, this is very important. So, I spent some time with a creative agency last year, and I wrote a new social media policy. Well, I wrote a social media policy, I didn't have one. I gave it wasn't very long, it was probably 1.5 sheets of A4 or something like that, saying what they could do, what they couldn't do, how they should treat their colleagues, how they should treat their clients, how they should do X, Y, Z. And they said, oh yes, it's nice and we better send it off to the lawyers so they can make it all formal. And I said do that, because if you do that, nobody's going to read it. But they wanted to send it off to the lawyers because it gave them sort of comfort that it was somehow official. These should be usable documents. These should be documents that actually mean things to people. If you capture them legally, nobody's going to read them. Nobody's going to take any notice of them at all. And therefore they will be useless. So they need to be short, they need to be succinct, they need to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it. And they really don't need to be too long. So understanding, getting people to understand what they should be doing is very important. So training people in all these guidelines, and very importantly, in the sanctions that will, it sounds a terrible thing to say, but it's very important actually, if things go wrong with the way people are using social media, if you have got a rogue employee who's using social media inappropriately, if you haven't told them what the sanctions are for doing that, then you may well, and this has happened in the UK, lose the case of unfair dismissal. Even if you've had a good social media policy in place, the fact that you haven't told about sanctions can cause you problems. So you need to take people through, and that doesn't mean just putting a document in, the employee handbook. It means explaining to people face to face what this means for them at work. Then you need to, if you want to take this actively at all, you need to start listening out and responding appropriately to the things that people are talking about. There are huge numbers of social media listening tools out there. Many of them are free, some of them are massively expensive, and then there are a few in the middle which you're worth looking at. But there's an awful lot you can do with them, to be honest, especially if you haven't got much of a budget. So listening out to what's going on, and then triaging. And not every critical comment that goes on social media is worth responding to. And this is another thing that people get wrong. On social media, because then you've got the whole world of it. Now, the reality is that most social media posts are read by the person who posts it and their mum. Things don't go like that, mostly. So if you're keeping an eye on things and you see things, a few people have commented on this, but it's not really out there, it's not worth worrying about. I remember a little store in Teacup a couple of years ago. There were something like 50,000 retweets of this particular thing, whatever it was, people getting awfully excited about it. I looked at the sort of people who were engaged in this conversation. They were almost exclusively in the marketing industry. They weren't consumers, ordinary consumers. They were just people saying, ooh, look at this company. Hasn't it been stupid in this social media? That for them as a social media writer just wasn't, because it wasn't something that the general public were engaged with at all. If it is something you want to respond to in some way, then understanding who should be responding to it is very important, because if it's an issue around compliance, or if it's an issue around libel, or if it's an issue around IT security, IT security, I'll give you an example of IT security in social media. It's very easy to post information which is potentially damaging to your organisation because you're giving away strategic information on social media. People tend to be very free with what they say. So there's a story, those Russian chaps who went into Ukraine. Well, they didn't go into Ukraine, did they? Because Mr. Putin said they didn't go to Ukraine. Anyway, some of their chaps, some of their soldiers thought, doing nice to take pictures, which they did, and they posted their pictures up onto Facebook. And of course, the pictures were geotagged. So it proved that those soldiers were in that particular park where they shouldn't have been very easily. But another story about a drug dealer in the States, and he very proud of his stash, took pictures of his stash and posted up on Facebook. Of course, the feds came around the next day and said, thank you very much for telling us where you are and what you have here. And so he got hauled off to jail. So that's if you have strategic information. So it's strategic for him, and he shouldn't really be letting it out there. So it's very easy to leak strategically important information. So you need to direct you need to understand who should be looking after any sort of unfortunate activity that's going on social media. It won't just be the marketing department, is my point. It needs to be the people who are equipped to deal with whatever's going wrong. And you need to, I said, a document, something on a page in the employee's handbook isn't enough. Think about enhanced training. Think about the way that you can bring this to life by making sure that people understand it and by making it relevant to them. Look for changing culture so that people understand that this is actually an important part of the way they work. Maintain awareness of this. Don't just give people one-off training, but make sure that people are aware of this all the time. Otherwise, they will forget what they should be doing. I'm going to finish in about 1 minute, I think. Right support for people who are managing this, the right tools, listening, things like that. Managing those all sorts of tools out there which you can automatically or with humans manage the posts that are coming in onto your social media accounts, either from employees or from general public. And yes, I've said that, but at all levels, the guidance at all levels is very important. And, prepare for the crisis that will probably happen to at least some of the organisations in here. And the thing I say about preparing for crisis is have plans in place. So understand what the sort of command structures are. Have some sort of templated responses for the various different risks that you've identified, and then practice them. Dealing with the social media crisis can be very stressful because people are very intemperate about what they say on social media, because they think they're talking to a computer, not to a human being. It can be very upsetting to be at the wrong end of the social media crisis. So if you practice that, you will likely develop a thick skin. But also, you'll understand that things are coming at you from all sorts of different directions, and therefore you need to prioritise. And going for the first thing that happens isn't necessarily the best thing. I can stop there. But if anybody's got any questions about this, then you do feel free to email me. I guess my email's going to be somewhere in there.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Thanks very much. I think we can just set up John in the next speaker. Just what's the size of the organisations in this room? Who's got 20 employees or fewer? Who's got 50 employees or more? Okay, right. I have 60 employees in our credit centre. I want to press a right there a couple of things. One, we didn't have any of the things that we didn't have policies, we didn't set out sanctions. We also didn't manage the Twitter accounts and other accounts with us. So, lo and behold, when a person in charge of one of our major activities or programs will have exactly the thing happening. All his social media revenue. And so we had to start again. Similarly, the phishing problem. There was an article in the FT this morning. A little while ago, the accounts person came around to see me and said, I think I actually called me, I wasn't in the office, and said, I'm just checking that you want us to send that money now. What money? Which was exactly that scam. Somebody impersonated my email and other identity, instructed the accounts department to send